Maria Muddy Poe Clemm was the daughter of Elizabeth Cairns and David Poe Jr. On July 17, 1817, at age 27, she was born in 1790, she became the second wife of William Clem Jr., a Baltimore hardware merchant and stepmother to his 5 children. William and Maria had 3 children of their own. Their youngest, Virginia, is most known for marrying writer Edgar Allan Poe. This union made Maria, who biologically was Poe's aunt, his mother-in-law. Maria survived all 3 of her children and her son-in-law. More scholarship is needed to discover how Poe, who was a lifelong outsider, got along with his cousins who were not biologically related to Mrs. Clem. Poe's aunt, and after he married his cousin Virginia, his mother-in-law, was called Muddy by Poe. Poe was a Virginian, and any depiction of him as not a Southerner is false. It could be that Muddy was a common nickname for a maternal figure. Although there is some debate as to whether or not she was a positive influence on Poe, there is no doubt that she cared for him like a son and that Poe certainly thought of her as a mother. The poem To My Mother, first published July 7, 1849, is clearly dedicated to her, while it also mentions Poe's biological mother, who died when he was a child. In 1844, Mrs. Clem apparently sold a bound volume of the Southern Literary Messenger Poe had borrowed from William Duane. Duane eventually managed to buy the book back through a series of deals, with his own signature still on the title page. Poe, however, continued to insist that Mrs. Clem had returned it, and his refusal to apologize to Duane caused a permanent rift in the friendship. Despite these difficulties, Sarah Helen Whitman recalled that Poe always spoke of her with grateful and affectionate consideration. I believe that she loved him devotedly. This is from her book, Poe's Helen. Mrs. Clem had 3 children with William Clem Jr. Henry, born September 10, 1818, Virginia Marie, born August 22, 1820, and Virginia Eliza, born August 13, 1822. William Clem Jr. would die in 1826, and Virginia Marie died in infancy only a few months after the birth of Virginia Eliza, who ultimately became Poe's wife. Mrs. Shue, in 1875, described Mrs. Clem as, you see, she, mutual friend Mrs. Richmond, speaks bitterly of Mrs. Clem, who was like a cat, often treacherous and cruel. She had a hard side to her nature, like many Southern persons who are or have been brought up with slaves as servants and associates in childhood. Mrs. Clem was too poor to ever have had slaves, and this very anti-Southern reminiscence is notable because Mrs. Clem earned the charity of many throughout her lifetime. Described by acquaintances as a rather ordinary, uncultivated woman with an almost masculine aspect, according to the National Park Service, Mrs. Clem served as the ever-vigilant guardian of the house. Devoted to Virginia and Edgar, she kept their houses in Philadelphia and elsewhere clean and neat, cooked the meals, and served as messenger, doing the errands, making pilgrimages between the poet and his publishers, a sort of secretary. After Poe's death in October 1849, Mrs. Clem was left without any source of income. It's not clear where all of her children were at this time. She survived largely from the generosity of Poe's friends and admirers. Among them, who sent her small sums, were Henry W. Longfellow and the Brit Charles Dickens. She was very loyal to her family and claimed she had burned hundreds of letters written to Poe by various literary women. The publisher Griswold had apparently offered her $500 for the letters of Frances S. Osgood, a female author who may have had a romance with Poe. She burned the letters to avoid any possibility that by poverty I might be induced to do anything so dishonorable, she wrote to Nielsen Poe in August 1861. Even when she was in dire straits, she refused to betray her son-in-law, even with the knowledge that he had loved other women after the death of her daughter. To learn more about her relationship with Poe, here is a letter Mrs. Clem wrote to her friend Annie Richmond in 1849, which is now held in the University of Virginia Special Collections. New York, June 30th, 1849. My dearest Annie, I have this moment received your letter of the 27th. I this day week received a letter from my own sweet Eddie. He writes he is better in health and rather better in spirits. He assures one he never did anything while he was so deranged that was in the least disgraceful. He fancied he was pursued by the police, but it was not so. I have gained all the particulars from several gentlemen to whom I wrote when I found I could not go to him. Dear Eddie wrote in his last letter that he was going from Richmond in a few days to stay with a friend in the country for a short time. I hope that is the reason I did not hear from him today. But Mrs. Clem would not hear from him, since he died in mysterious circumstances in 1849. This photograph, one of the only two known of Mrs. Clem, is from a daguerreotype originally owned by Annie Richmond and sent to the biographer John H. Ingram in 1876. It was probably taken in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1849. The second, reprinted in E. L. Didier's The Poe Cult and Other Papers, shows her in 1868, considerably more aged but wearing a remarkably similar dress. It may have been the same dress, as very few people could afford multiple outfits at the time. This is another reminder that white privilege has frankly never existed. So where did Mrs. Clem live after Poe's death? Mrs. Shue, who became Mrs. Houghton, wrote to Mrs. S. H. Whitman on May 20th, 1875. Where did Mrs. Clem go after she went to Lowell the last time? She left my house in the spring of 1852 as I removed west at that time, she not wishing to go with us immediately. Mrs. Clem spent the winter and part of the summer of 1850 with us, and the winter of 1851 when she went to Lowell again. On March 30th, 1874, Mrs. S. H. Whitman wrote to J. H. Ingram, I enclose the first letter I ever received from Mrs. Clem. It is dated from Lowell and written 19 days after Edgar's death. She was then visiting Mrs. Charles, or Annie, Richmond in Lowell. When I next heard from her, she was in New York, but returned, I think, the following winter to Lowell. She subsequently passed some time, I think, in the family of Mr. W. Strong, Milford, Connecticut. Some years afterwards, she lived for a time with Mrs. Lewis. In 1852, Mrs. Clem was indeed living in Milford, Connecticut, with the family of William Strong. This may seem odd to us, but hospitality was the American tradition for centuries. You were expected to be hospitable to friends, family, extended family, and even travelers on the road. On May 27, 1875, Mrs. S. H. Whitman wrote to J. H. Ingram, I looked among Mrs. Clem's earlier letters for dates of her residence with Mrs. Lewis. In December 1854, I find a letter from Mrs. Macready, the actress and elocutionist who brought credentials to me from Mrs. Clem in the autumn of that year. She says under December 8, 1854, I have passed since my return 2 or 3 evenings with dear Mrs. Clem at the house of Mrs. Lewis. About 1857, it appears Mrs. Clem was living with Mrs. S. A. Lewis. Mrs. S.H. Whitman wrote to J.H. Ingram on February 16, 1874. In the winter and spring of 1858, Mrs. Clem resided for a time with Mr. and Mrs. Lewis in Lafayette Place, I think in New York. Lafayette Place was a grand address that also housed the Astors. Mr. and Mrs. Lewis separated soon after, and Mrs. Clem, having, I believe, taken part with Mr. Lewis against the lady, was made very uncomfortable and wrote me that the situation as a guest in the house was becoming very embarrassing. She left them soon after Mrs. Lewis went abroad, so Mrs. Clem was involving herself in domestic disputes in New York at the time. In 1859, Mrs. Clem was living in Alexandria, Virginia, as her letters of April 14, 1859, August 19, 1860, and August 26, 1860 show. On May 27, 1875, Mrs. S.H. Whitman wrote to J.H. Ingram. In 1858, Mrs. Clem was still living with Mrs. Lewis and had only recently left for the home of friends in Alexandria when Mr. Davidson and I called on Mrs. Lewis at her home in Irving Place, New York, but did not find her at home. Where did Mrs. Clem live in Alexandria? I dug through the records and found her living at the intersection of Orinoco Street, spelled at the time with a K, and North Washington Street. So which of the 4 intersection buildings did Mrs. Clem live in? Well, the Lee family of Robert E. Lee lived across the street in 2 buildings for almost a continuous 2 centuries, so I doubt she was living there. It would have been very exciting if friends of the Lewises were actually the Lees, and Mrs. Clem was staying with a prominent American family. But there's no evidence of this. I highly recommend a visit to the Lee Fendel House, which is a kaleidoscope-style house open to the public here at the intersection that Mrs. Clem knew so well. It's unique because it gets bigger based on a shed or a kitchen extending all the way to the parlor and one of the few kaleidoscope-style houses open to the public. There is also a very fine brick home on the corner that may have housed Mrs. Clem. But I think with her reduced circumstances at the time, she was living in the more modest brick duplex, which is now offices. It has a small side garden very similar to the side garden in the Poe home in Philadelphia, which is also worth a visit if you are willing to deal with D.A. Krasner's lack of attention to Philadelphia crime. Regardless, with neighbors such as the Lees, this was a very fine part of town in the 1860s and a nice place for Mrs. Clem to spend 2 years. She would have watched barrels rolled down Orinoco Street to the docks on what is now called Union Street. Like many southern cities, Alexandria was occupied by Yankee Union forces during and after the Civil War, and they made various changes to street names as well as insisted on living in people's homes. So the records on residential living during the Civil War are very difficult to discern. One has to remember that a large part of the Yankee Union forces were actually foreign-born, and so they were promised different perks by Union leadership, such as citizenship, and so their spelling of certain streets, Orinoco to Orinoco, is evident here. Mrs. Clem, staying with friends from 1859 to 1861, was a walking distance away from the Stabler Ledbetter Apothecary. This building is retained as a museum, and you can see how easy it was to gain access to medicines without a prescription before the FDA was founded. Mrs. Clem was also walking distance away from several churches and the Old Town Farmers Market, which is still active, as well as the City Hall, which is formerly where criminals were hung. I was curious to see whether Old Town Alexandria honored Mrs. Clem's presence here. She was known to carry Edgar Allan Poe memorabilia with her and probably showed a lot of it to Alexandria citizens, everything from drafts of his work to a piece of his coffin. But I found nothing for Mrs. Clem, no plaque or otherwise. This isn't surprising considering the old Town Alexandria City Hall decked itself in flags of South American countries instead of American flags to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month or Hispanic Heritage or something. With the number of illegals surpassing half the population of the state of Wyoming as of 2023, celebrating demographic replacement is in very poor taste, but many jurisdictions do so. By June 29, 1861, Mrs. Clem was living in Putnam, Ohio, in the home of Sally E. Robbins. Miss Robbins had devoted herself to the task of writing a biography of Poe, but was overcome by fits of madness and never completed it. She was confined to an asylum in 1861. At this point, Mrs. Clem was left without a clear means of support. By the spring of 1863, she had returned to Baltimore, where she hoped to be admitted to the Baltimore Widows' Home. Widows' homes across American cities were a commonality for centuries, and they had a lot of oversight by local and state officials. Veterans' widows as well as widows' homes existed, and they were different from senior citizen centers because they were not solely fixated on profit. Unable to procure the $150 fee for the widow's home, she instead became a resident of the Episcopal Church home, which had taken over the building in which her beloved nephew had died in 1849. She would spend the remainder of her years until 1871 in the same building her nephew had died in. A note from the Daily National Intelligencer stated, Dickens, it is reported, has sent $1,000 to Mrs. Clem, the mother-in-law of Edgar A. Poe, who is an inmate of a charitable institution in Baltimore and has been for years in extremely indigent circumstances as of February 1868. A recently discovered version of the Ultima Thule daguerreotype once belonged to Sarah or Sally E. Robbins, the gifted, tragic young poet who went insane while writing a vindication of Poe's life and works. After Poe's death, many editors moved to besmirch him, and there was a movement to vindicate him in American literature. The daughter of a well-to-do family residing in Putnam, Ohio, Miss Robbins began her work on Poe in about 1860 when she was 24. Apparently inspired by a reading of Edgar Poe and his critics, she opened a correspondence with Sarah Helen Whitman, and in 1861 was put in touch with Mrs. Clem and invited her to become her house guest in Putnam, where she could serve as a source of information for Miss Robbins' proposed book. The impoverished Mrs. Clem accepted the offer, but soon after her arrival in Ohio, her benefactress collapsed and was confined to a nearby asylum with little hope of permanent recovery. About 1862, Miss Robbins entered the Spengler Institute, a female-only seminary for young women in New York. In the mid-1860s, she was living in a convent in Ontario, Canada. Despite all of this, she returned to Putnam in 1868, where she died the following year, age 32. How Sally Robbins acquired the daguerreotype of Poe is not completely certain, but there is some indication she received it as a gift from Sarah Helen Whitman. However, I disagree and believe she received it as a gift from Mrs. Clem herself. After Robbins' death, the plate passed to her niece, the versatile and talented Elizabeth Robbins, who lived from 1862 to 1952, and she settled in Great Britain in 1890. There, she achieved recognition not only as a leading stage actress, but as a prominent essayist and author. In November 1964, Elizabeth's vast collection of diaries, correspondence, and family memorabilia was purchased by the Fales Library of New York University. Owing to the enormity of the collection, however, the daguerreotype of Poe remained in storage unnoticed for the next 20 years. In 1985, during a comprehensive cataloging of the Robbins family papers, the plate was discovered by Special Collections curator Frank Walker. Accompanying the picture were two previously unpublished letters from Poe, both addressed to Maria Clem, upholding my theory. While Mrs. Clem is not the most romantic figure in Poe's life, she shouldn't be ignored, and her homebody maternal presence helped ensure the Poe legacy so that it could exist until today. If interested, there is a lot of Poe material available online, including at eapoe.org, as well as at archive.org, as well as in the Poe museums in Virginia, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Unfortunately, local officials are less and less interested in preserving American history and mysteries of American history. Wherever you live or visit, you are walking in the shoes of people who have come before you, who are critical to the story of America. And the heritage of America is worth preserving and protecting.